December 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Soon after, 10 other states in the Deep South joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. Within the year, the North and South were at war. The Civil War would split the nation in two. It would rage on for 4 years, cost 600,000 lives, and wound many more in body and spirit. It was a bloody war that at times pitted brother against brother. American men, some as young as 15 and 16 years old, slaughtered each other in small-town streets, wheat fields, and apple orchards. Whole cities were destroyed. How could this happen in America? The North and South had always had their disagreements, but they had been able to put them aside to form a union, the United States of America. So what changed? Why did Southern states decide to split from the North? What brought on the unimaginable horrors that nearly split America forever? In the early 1800s, America was growing in leaps and bounds. In the North, internal improvements and trade were the order of the day. Investors poured millions of dollars into transportation systems that would connect one region to the next for the benefits of trade. Completion of the Erie Canal made its investors wealthy men as food and produce poured into New York from the west and manufactured goods floated to the interior. A building boom in canals quickly followed. When Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb puffed out of Baltimore in 1830, few thought much of it. But by 1860, 30,000 miles of railroads linked the nation together. Europe too grew closer as the shift from sail to steam engine cut the travel time to Liverpool from New York from a couple of months to a couple of weeks. Most people still worked on farms, but the North was rapidly industrializing. Using new machines and interchangeable parts, Northern factories poured out sewing machines, farm machinery, clothing, and other goods. Americans were so good at it that the British called the making of things by machine rather than hand the American system of manufacturing. Industry created jobs. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany and teenagers from American farms poured into northern cities like Lowell, Massachusetts and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to work as wage earners in factories. Stores sprung up, shelves brimming with goods to sell to workers. Banks sprung up to finance business and trade. A booming market economy was transforming the North. Life was quite different in the South. There, agriculture was the major source of jobs and wealth. Long growing seasons and rich soil produced rice, tobacco, and cotton, cash crops grown for sale in distant markets. The vast majority of Southern whites were poor farmers who eked out a living as best they could. But big plantation owners with many slaves dominated the South, economically, socially, and politically. The North had outlawed slavery in the decades following the American Revolution. Back then, many Americans believed that slavery would die out on its own because it was no longer profitable. But then something happened. Raw cotton had always been very expensive because it took too long to separate the sticky seeds from the fiber. Then, in 1793, Eli Whitney, a young teacher from New England, invented the cotton gin. With this simple machine, a slave could clean more than 50 pounds of cotton a day. The cotton gin transformed cotton from a luxury item into the world's cheapest fabric. Booming textile factories in the northern states and England paid good money for all they could get, and the South was the world's major supplier.
There was a bigger demand for cotton, and in order to get that cotton, the South needed a lot of land. To work the land, they needed a large labor force, and the largest, cheapest labor force available was the enslaved African.
Doubling in value every 10 years, cotton production soon dominated the Southern economy. The Cotton Belt spread west across the South. Close to 1 million slaves were marched in chains to the southern frontier, where they cleared land and grew cotton to make their masters rich.
So by the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the states in the South, the Deep South, were really committed to slavery because it gave them an economic advantage.
The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran the fastest, there he whipped the longest.
Southern wealth rested on the backs of slaves. Even though some slave owners treated their slaves well, Southern slavery was brutal, degrading, and deadly. Dressed only in coarse linen clothing, children received only 2 shirts a year. When these failed them, they went naked, winter or summer. It was not uncommon for slaves to work from dawn to dusk, then do their own washing, mending, and cooking before falling to sleep. They slept on cold, damp, bare floors, often with only a coarse blanket, even in the cold of winter. Slaves considered a good master one who gave them enough to fill their stomachs. Many had barely enough to eat. Believing that slaves couldn't be governed except with the whip, masters and overseers beat men and women, young and old, even pregnant women, for any reason or for none. Born a slave in Maryland, Frederick Douglass revealed the hardships and horrors of slavery in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. According to Douglass, to be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished.
Frederick Douglass in his autobiography talks about seeing a young mother beaten while her children watched, unable to do anything to stop them. And this is something that's hard for us to understand, but we just need to remember that the enslaved people were not considered people, they were considered property.
Douglass escaped in 1838 and soon thereafter became one of America's most powerful voices against slavery. Not every black man and woman in the South was a slave.
In the 1800s, during the period that slavery was still very much alive in this country, there were tens of thousands, actually, of African people, people of African descent, who were free, one way or another. They had run away, they had managed to get free after their slave owners died, their relatives bought them out, and sometimes out of conscience, people would release their slaves.
Some of them traveled north, particularly places like Philadelphia, and increased the black population. And it was through free black community building that the modern black community emerged, so with churches, with organizations, with a sense of self. And even as they tried to become Americans, they also wanted to hold on to this separate identity. So it was a free black population that was increasingly conscious of its place in America and its need to define its place in America.
They held a variety of occupations. They were draymen, they were bricklayers, they were carpenters, and in fact, in Charleston, most of the building trades were dominated by free blacks.
But such cases were rare indeed. The vast majority of African Americans lived and died as slaves. Despite the harsh treatment, African American slaves and free blacks built a world of their own. Mixing African and American traditions, they poured out their joys and sorrows in music and dance, practiced their own brand of soulful Christianity, held on to their families as best they could, and carried on their private lives in the secrecy of the slave quarters. They resisted slavery in many ways, breaking tools, burning down barns and houses, running away to the north or to Indian tribes on the frontier. Some poisoned their masters. Some revolted. In 1811, slaves marched on New Orleans and were defeated in a pitched battle. Their decapitated heads were hung on poles as a warning to others. The greatest of all the uprisings took place in Southampton County, Virginia, and was led by a slave preacher named Nat Turner.
As I was praying one day at my plow, the Spirit spoke to me, saying, Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you. I was greatly astonished, and for 2 years prayed continually. I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun darkened.
And he led a group of about 6 men heading from his owner's farm to an area called Jerusalem. On the way there, they killed 61 whites. The federal and state troops were called out against them, but they were able to elude them for about 6 weeks. Then they were captured, and he and 16 others were executed.
News of Turner's revolt spread terror throughout the South. Imagine what would happen if other slaves, now 1/3 of the Southern population, followed Turner's lead.
People lie down to sleep with fear. They hardly venture out on nights. A lady told me that for weeks after the tragedy, she had quivered at every blast of wind and every blow of the shutter.
White Southerners came to fear their slaves ever more, and so they clamped down. You see a whole series of post-Nat Turner laws that to make sure that the slave patrols actually went out on patrol to make sure that the slaves weren't assembling somewhere and gathering weapons and going to rise up against their masters. Laws passed to prevent slaves from learning how to read and write so they couldn't communicate with one another and couldn't get these ideas, because one of the other things white Southerners thought about was that, well, they couldn't have gotten ideas of freedom on their own account. They must have come from someplace else. Where? Why, they must have come from those abolitionists up in the North.
The Americans say that we are ungrateful, but I ask them, for heaven's sake, what should we be grateful to them for? For murdering our fathers and mothers? Or do they wish us to return thanks to them for chaining and handcuffing us, branding us, cramming fire down our throats, or for keeping us in slavery and beating us nearly or quite to death to make us work in ignorance and miseries, to support them and their families?
The publication of former slave David Walker's Appeal in 1829 hit the South like a thunderbolt. Calling for violent rebellion by slaves, it was the most vigorous denunciation of slavery ever published in the U.S.
In fact, the slaveholders in the South called upon the governor of Massachusetts to arrest David Walker, and they issued a $10,000 reward ransom for his head.
No compromise with slavery. No union with slaveholders,
cried William Lloyd Garrison, who, after reading Walker's Appeal and seeing slavery in practice on a visit to Baltimore, started the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. Calling for an immediate end to the institution of slavery, his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, quickly became the most important abolitionist publication in the country. Garrison pulled no punches in his denunciation of slaveholders.
We would sooner trust the honor of the country in the hands of the inmates of our penitentiaries and prisons than in their hands. They are the meanest of thieves and the worst of robbers. We do not acknowledge them to be within the pale of Christianity or republicanism or humanity.
Such strong talk alarmed not just Southerners, but Northerners as well, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. Most Americans thought of abolitionists as dangerous troublemakers. Angry crowds nearly lynched Garrison in Boston, burned down the new Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia, and murdered Elijah P. Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois. Many others would also lose their lives in the fight against slavery. Despite violence and opposition, the abolitionist movement quickly grew in the North among ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Free blacks in the North also played a key role in the abolitionist movement. They organized themselves into local anti-slavery societies and worked hand in hand with whites for the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad, of course, was not underground, and it was not a railroad. It was a hidden method of slaves to escape from the South to freedom either in the North or all the way to Canada.
Escaped slaves also played major roles. Frederick Douglass, William Box Brown, and Sojourner Truth wrote autobiographies and gave lectures on the horrors of slavery.
Then, of course, you had Harriet Tubman, who became a conductor in the Underground Railroad, who returned to the South at least 15 times and freed some 300 African Americans from slavery.
American women